Boker Tov, everyone. In this week's Parsha of Emor, we learn a lot of the rules about forbidden relationships, who one can marry, but specifically about the priests. And for the most part, when people think about priests or Kohanim, it usually only comes up on, when people are being called up to the Torah, the custom to have a Kohen go first, or a few times a year when the Kohanim come up on the high holidays and they do duchenin, they do, the Vulcan sign, and they bring down God's blessings on the people. But we don't think about, classically, their roles used to be that they ran the temple. We know that, but we never really think about that. And one of the things that also doesn't come up is the important laws about who they can and cannot marry. There are all of these different rules about who a Kohen is allowed to marry. And the thing is, those rules are not only relevant in the times of the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, they're still relevant today, to the point where if a Kohen, and this can be very painful, if a Kohen, a priest, marries someone who is forbidden to him, and we're actually going to look at who those people are, there are penalties. If it was the time of the temple, he couldn't bring sacrifices. But today, if a Kohen marries either a divorcee or a non-Jew, which isn't on this list, it's just kind of assumed there, they can't be called up to the Torah as a Kohen. They cannot be allowed to do the special duchenin, the special blessing. They're still a Jew. They still count in a minyan, but their status as a Kohen is something special. It is something that is above being just a Jew. It is a special role. And in order to maintain that role, there are certain rules that they have to follow. Why? What's the connection between who they marry and their ability to serve in God's temple? We don't know the answer because the Torah doesn't tell us explicitly, but we're going to look at some of the ideas, both from classical sources, and we're also going to look at some contemporary scholarship. And in fact, both of the scholars we're going to look at are women. And while you think, well, we're talking here about a bunch of men, Kohanim are men, however, what it really touches on is the fact that it's not just about the Kohanim, it's about the women they marry and how their status, what is it about them, these women, that might somehow affect the Kohen and lower their Kedusha, lower their sanctity, that they wouldn't be able to serve fully in the Beit HaMikdash. And we're going to touch on some ideas that are quite uncomfortable and make some implications that we may not be okay with. Now, again, they may not be the truth, because again, the Torah doesn't tell us, but it's very interesting to see how these scholars figure out what might be going on based on the texts. So with all that in mind, are there any questions before we jump in? Excellent. So Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and I'm going to go ahead and see if I can, yep. Hope I didn't make this too big. Gloria, so I'm actually going to have you take these two verses. They're both from this week's Parasha. Isabel, do you have a question? Okay, so they're both from this week's Parasha, and the difference between them is the first one talks about a typical Kohen, that their name is Cohen or Katz or something like that, just a regular Kohen, and who they're not permitted to marry. And the second one is about the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, because they have a stricter list of who they're allowed to marry. There's really only one kind of woman they can marry, and we're going to come back to it at the end and kind of figure out what's the connection between all these women. So Gloria, go ahead, source number 1.
They shall not marry a woman who is a prostitute or a profane woman, and they shall not take a wife divorced from her husband, for he, the priest, is holy unto his God.
Excellent. So actually, I think either last week or on Shabbat, I talked about the word kadosh, which we translate as holy. It's used multiple ways in the Torah, but in the context of a priest, it means something more like he is dedicated specifically to a purpose, and anything that would affect his purpose. I actually talked about this in the past year, a firefighter. They are dedicated to fighting fires and medical things as well. And they have certain tools that they need to maintain. They need to have their safety gear. And if their safety gear is not taken care of, they cannot do their job. So too for a Kohen, because they are dedicated, they are mekudash, they're specifically holy, sanctified for a purpose. There's certain things that they need to maintain, including things like their clothing, just like a uniform professional, but also who they marry affects their ability to do their job. Like, that's just the simplest way to understand it. Something about who they marry affects their ability to do their job properly and represent the people as they serve God. Now, there's actually 4 different things it talks about here, or 3 different things. It talks about a prostitute. In Hebrew, it says zonah. And we'll go back to what does it mean by a prostitute, because the next one is here I'll just scroll over to Hebrew for a second. It says a halala. Now the word halal, often there's different meanings of it. Could mean, halal is often the opposite of kadosh, can mean secular. But here it's talking about a woman who is halala. And again, it doesn't explicitly say what that means, but in the context of women who have sexual relationships outside of marriage, a prostitute appears to be one who does it professionally, and a halala, and again, we'll get back to this at the end, a halala is a woman who has had sex outside of marriage. Now, we're going to put zonah aside, prostitute aside, but halala does not mean that she's a bad woman. We're going to come back to why that's an issue, because many wonderful, righteous, incredible women had sex before marriage. It doesn't make them monsters or wicked. And that's not what's being implied here, because except for a zonah potentially, these other things are only forbidden to a kohen. And that's the key here. These are not bad people. They are permitted to be married. They're full Jews, assuming they're Jews or Israelites, whatever. It's specifically something about a kohen, which is, again, what we'll talk about today. And also a divorced woman. And again, even more so, you're like, well, what's wrong there? And we'll look at some different possibilities there. So there's actually only 3 things here. So it's 4 that are forbidden to the Kohen Gadol. So it's those 3 are forbidden. And then Gloria, go ahead. This next set of verses expands upon it.
He shall marry a woman in her virginity. He shall not marry a widow, a divorcee, a profane woman, or a prostitute. He shall marry only a virgin of his own people.
Now, that last thing there that I'm not going to go into too much, where it says a woman of his own people, me'amav, I didn't look into it too much, but that's an interesting question. And the rabbis are also perplexed about why does it say that? Of course, he's going to marry an Israelite or a Jew, whatever you're going to call it. So why is that there? But the important thing we're focusing on is it includes that this is the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, cannot marry a widow, cannot marry this halala, this woman who has had sex before marriage. And it also, again, at the beginning, it says explicitly a betula, she needs to be a virgin. So obviously she's never had sex before she gets married, but it still includes the whole list, the zonah, a prostitute, the halala, a divorcee, which again, not a divorcee hasn't necessarily slept with her husband, but for many reasons, presumably she has. But it adds here widow. Now, again, it could have just said that the high priest must marry a virgin who has never been married and would include all of this. So the question is, why does it go to this extent? And why does it add widow in here? So these are all things, and again, it doesn't explain it, but these are all clues that the later scholars, again, our last sources, will pick up on and come up with a hypothesis, meaning it's not necessarily provable. But this is the basis here. The Kohanim can marry, they cannot marry a woman who is a prostitute. They cannot marry a woman who regularly has sex outside of marriage, and they cannot marry a woman who has been divorced. And the only difference is which presumably means, I think, that it would have to be a virgin, practically speaking. Susan, I see your hand, I'll get you in 1 second. But the Kohen Gadol additionally cannot marry a widow. So why is that on there? And she definitely has to be explicitly a virgin. So presumably that the source number 1, when it says this halala, it's not necessarily a woman who has simply lost her virginity. It's a woman who's not a prostitute, but she'll sleep with people, outside of marriage with some regularity. Again, there's some assumptions here, but context seems to prove that. Whereas the Kohen Gadol, she has to be 100% a virgin and she can't be a widow. So Susan, I will go ahead and unmute you and then leave you unmuted for your question and to read.
Oh dear, this is
You
what I get.
learned at this.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, please.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry I'm late, but
Please.
My understanding of this is that he can marry the widow of another Kohen.
No, well,
maybe
so
you're going to get to that, or maybe I'm just wrong. I don't know.
So we will come back to that, but here it says she explicitly has to be a virgin. Although the next source that I'll have you read is quite short, is, this is where it gets confusing. So we just read what the Torah said, but the Haftorah this week from the book of Yechezkel also talks about who a Kohen is permitted to marry. And go ahead, Susan.
Okay. They shall not marry a widow or a divorcee. They shall marry only virgins of the seed of the house of Israel, but they may marry the widow of a priest. Okay, that's where I heard it.
So here,
Yechezkel
Yechezkel doesn't make a distinction between the Kohen and the Kohen Gadol in this case. So this is at least true of all Kohanim, but it's potential that a Kohen cannot marry a widow, but it's not clear. Yechezkel does muddy the situation. But this is also, again, these are the kind of clues and hints that later scholars, and we as well, can pick up on the text, is what are some of the things that are different here in Yechezkel? And it adds on this whole thing. It's the widow of a priest is fine. So it's clearly someone that presumably has slept with a man before. But what's the difference? The man that she slept before was a priest. But in the verses in Vayikra, the assumption is that the men that she has slept with were not priests. So it's not about the fact that she slept with someone. That's not what makes her, that would lower the kedusha of a priest. It's some sort of connection. We'll come back to this explicitly in the later sources. There's something that happens when she sleeps with a man who is not a Kohen. It does something to her that she can then carry on to the Kohen. But if she sleeps with only another Kohen and she's widowed, that's a key thing. That's also, it doesn't just say, it is not a divorcee. Specifically, it has to be a widow. So presumably a divorcee of a priest could not marry another one, but a widow could. So those are two very important hints that'll be picked up on in later sources. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to look at a number of different sources. This first one here is important because it's part of the conversation, but it's fairly easy to reject, and it's not the strongest opinion here. It's just more like, let's be aware of what's being said out there. So soon I'll just have you take this one because it's so short. So this is Ralbag, who was actually a student. I don't know if he was directly, but he was essentially a student of Maimonides. And many of his opinions are very, I don't say progressive, but he has a lot of Maimonides in him. But here he's trying to understand what's the issue with a divorcee, which is an issue for both for Kohanim and the high priest as well. So go ahead, please.
They shall not take a wife divorced from her husband. The fact that she was divorced shows that something negative about her was discovered, and it is not appropriate for a priest to marry a woman who did not befit an ordinary Israelite.
So this, I think, is really the only source that I found that makes it really about the woman herself. And it's saying that obviously she got divorced because something was wrong with her. Now, to go on how problematic that is and how, it's not good. It's not good to say that. It's not true. And one of the things this is just a general tangential thing about divorce in general, is people often give divorce a bad rap. Now, obviously, it can be very painful for the family to get a divorce, but a divorce might actually be very good for the couple and for the family. Divorce is a mitzvah in the Torah. It is recognized as such, and in no way is it seen as a negative thing. The fact that it became negative within other religions is just a very sad state. And the fact that in American law, until fairly recently, until the 70s, it was basically like more or less against the law. It was permitted, but it was really difficult to get it, was not a good thing. It hurt a lot of couples. So first of all, it could just be the man. It could be 100% his fault. Or this woman could be perfect, but she just didn't fit with that man. Regardless, this is really the only one that says it's about her. But the reason Ralbag even mentions this is the Torah doesn't explain it. So he's trying to think, what's the problem with divorce in general? Also, it doesn't speak to the other categories. But he's saying that maybe the idea here is that the Kohen, because of his status as a leader of the people, needs to, marry someone who's also like of the certainly high social status. He needs to have the best household, just something about, he needs to be marrying the best of the best woman. And to marry a woman that was divorced, there might be some sort of stigma there. Now, again, as I'm saying, that stigma should not be there, and the Torah doesn't recognize it anywhere else, but that's kind of his point. So again, it's out there. I just wanted to present it, but it's fairly easy to reject, and I would say nobody, but it's not really picked up as the reason for it, but I just put it out there. But the next ideas here from section C onwards are all very much connected. They all have something in common, which is there's nothing wrong with the woman. However, when she gets married to another person, especially if they're not a priest, there's some sort of connection that they make when they get married. Now, on the one hand, that's beautiful. And someone told me that in modern Hebrew today, the word for marriage is nisuim brit. Nisuim is like getting married, and brit is a covenant. So it's saying it's not just a matter of getting married, but it's an unbreakable bond, which obviously there are ways to break it when appropriate to do so. And that is an important mitzvah tool. But when people get married, there's some sort of connection that they get. And even if they get divorced, that connection never really goes away. However, If a woman gets widowed, maybe that connection is broken to some extent. We'll come back to that. But this first one is from a contemporary source. This woman, Sarah Schechtman, I forgot where she taught, but she is a scholar. You can look at her article on academia.edu. And she actually mentions another American scholar who passed away in 2010, I believe, Jacob Milgram. He was one of the greatest scholars in recent history of the Bible. And Jane, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And what she's going to focus on is, again, just the general bond that people get, not necessarily from sleeping together, but more in general, just from being married with each other. So Jane, please.
Jacob Milgram argues that a negative stigma was associated with divorce. However, since divorce is not elsewhere negatively stigmatized in the Hebrew Bible, an explanation along the lines of alienation.
You know what? I copied and pasted this,
Alienation,
so that might be
maybe? The defining factor in these rules about women offers a more plausible solution. If the husband is still alive despite the divorce, the women's primary male bond remains slightly muddled. If the husband is dead, then issues of alienation no longer exist.
There you go.
He is adequate for Aaronite priests generally, but not for the high priest, who presumably, because of his increased sanctity, must marry a woman whose primary male bond has only been to her father.
So excellent job on figuring that out, Jane.
Yes.
But again, as he said here, when they get married, there's some sort of bond here, and it doesn't make it, one of the sources will make it to some extent about the sexual connection they have, but here it's just the bond of marriage, which there's an intimacy, there's the love, the romantic, maybe they've had a family together, and when they're divorced, even if it was a horrible, relationship, and again, it's so much better for them that they're apart, there's still some sort of connection there. Now, again, where I can't say a blanket statement, every divorced couple always has some sort of bond. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not, and maybe there's a sliding scale of it. Some that got divorced, but they still have, they still have a friendship with them. That's somewhat common as well. And some that want nothing to do with the person at all, but they were still married to them and they loved them, hopefully at some point, but there's still a connection there. However, when they are, when that person passes away, meaning they didn't choose to get divorced, the reason they're no longer together is because the husband passed away, then there's an interesting thing there, because there's no divorce there, but they say, that connection doesn't really, you would think that connection would be even stronger then. So that might be a challenge to this argument. If they get divorced because they didn't work together, then that would almost break the bond. But if they're widowed, then that love presumably or possibly never went away. But they see this connection as being there present when the person is still alive. And that's the key there. As long as the other person is still alive, there's still some spiritual, psychological connection. But once the person has passed away, and again, psychologically, that's not true. When someone loses someone, they think about them often. And that does become a factor. A member of my family, his wife passed away. And he's been dating for years, but he can never completely disconnect from his wife. And sometimes that's a challenge. That's really cool, Susan, what you just shared. I'd love to hear more about that later. But it's been a challenge. And there are people who this member of my family has dated, and they realize, you're never really going to get over your first wife. Not that he has to, but that's a factor that still remains. So again, the Torah doesn't explain what's going on. So Sarah Schechtman is kind of trying to figure out what might be the issue with marrying these people who are divorced, and why, at least for a regular Kohen, a widow might be okay, because some kind of bond is no longer present. Again, psychologically it's there, but living, they're never going to be thinking about, I can go back to them. So before we go on, and again, this gets on a very personal, painful topics. But again, they're trying to figure out what these connections are for a Kohen who has to make major life decisions about who they're going to marry, based on the position that they need to hold in society, not just who they love. So questions up until now. Excellent. So Isabel, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And again, the next sources here all kind of have something in common. So I'll have you take this next line and the one after it because they're so short. So one idea here, now we're shifting into, it's not just that they were married that created that bond, it's specifically because they slept with each other, which again is not a bad thing. It's a mitzvah, for people to have children. So obviously the Torah thinks that's fine for people to sleep with each other for children, but we'll put that aside. So is there anything negative that could ever be associated with two, specifically a male and a female sleeping with each other? And generally no, but in the context of the priesthood, there might be. And one of the sources that actually the scholar at the end who will read, Dr. Eve Levavi Feinstein, pointed out some of these sources. And she brings up one of the most painful moments in the Torah, which was when Jacob's daughter Dinah is taken away. And she's, again, the story is not clear if it was mutual or not, but presumably she was raped. And what's very key here, go ahead, Isabel, just read this short line, then I'll point out the important word here. Go ahead, source number one, Jacob heard.
Jacob heard that he had polluted his daughter Dinah.
Excellent. So the key word here is polluted in Hebrew is timeh, which is often translated as impure, tuma. A Kohen cannot be in a state of impurity. They must always maintain a state of purity so that they can bring offerings. If they become impure, they cannot do their job. So obviously, if they can't help themselves, they have to do they find someone who passed away on the road. It's a mitzvah to give that someone a burial. Even the high priest would have to come late to Yom Kippur and become tameh to give someone an honorable burial. But they cannot choose to go out of their way to become tumah. And we see here that in this one case, it is possible through sex that some sort of tumah impurity can be passed on. In fact, that's true. When a woman is menstruating, she is in a state of tumah, which again does not make her a bad person. All it has to do with is in that state, in that time, she cannot go to the temple and give an offering. If she comes upon her husband, he takes on that tumah and he cannot make an offering until he purifies himself. So for a woman who is impure to come upon her priest husband, that would be a problem because his main job is every single day to make offerings. So if there's any kind of tumah associated through sleeping with someone, that would be a problem. Now, presumably these women who are forbidden to a priest, they just wait till they're not menstruating. So where does the tumah come from? And what they're getting at here, and again, this scholar at the end, Dr. Eve Levavi Feinstein, is she's suggesting is that when a woman sleeps with a man, she takes something from him, and it's probably more spiritual than anything, but the thing that she absorbs from him, again, it's not bad, it's not evil or wicked or anything like that, but it's a lower form of kedusha, lower form of holiness. And if she then marries a Kohen and then sleeps with him, she will imbue that to him. So it's not the explicit forms of impurity like when a woman's menstruating or coming across something that is, a dead animal or something like that. It's not one of those. It's something else entirely. And again, we're in hypothesis land, but again, the sources kind of start to work together this way. If you see it as if a woman absorbs something from her first husband or another man that she slept with, she can pass that on to the Kohen and it would lower his kedusha. And that comes out again in this next source from later in the Torah in Devarim, and in a very interesting way. And it talks about if a man is married to a woman and then he dies, it is a mitzvah for his brother to then marry her and have children with her. But the status of those children, very interesting. So Isabel, please, source number one in this section from Devarim.
If brothers dwell together and one of them die and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry abroad to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in to her and take her to him to wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn which she bears shall succeed in the name of his brother who is dead, that his name be not wiped out of Israel.
Excellent, thank you. So this is pushing it a little bit, but in some ways not. The children are not considered the children of the brother who actually, they're technically his biological children. They are considered the children of the first husband. There is an inherent connection that the first husband who was with that woman is always there. So the idea here, the reason to bring the source is, again, when a woman has been with a man and they slept together, there is something that stays with her. And again, we're really getting here into the spiritual realm. And that's really important there. And then the key here is that the Kohen needs to have essentially a virgin, certainly the high priest, because they cannot have any of that lower kedusha coming from a non-Israelite. They need to keep everything as pure as possible, not because other Israelites are bad, but because for them to be able to do their job, they need to have a certain level of kedusha. They need to have a certain level of purity in everything they do. And the only thing that their wife can bring with them is the connection she has with their family, not with any other man, because that would lower things down and make him not able to do his job. So before we go on, any questions up until now? Yeah, Jane, go ahead and unmute you. Go ahead, please.
Do we get the custom of naming the child after the dead brother? His name, in fact, the naming. Do we get that from this pasuk, or is it just a custom?
That's a great question. I don't know. It certainly would make sense. I mean, there is a general custom, and I actually had read the sources before, naming after people who have passed away.
I know the Sephardim name after living people.
Yes, they do. So that might be more of an interesting history. Why do they do that and not do that? And again, there's a way to get out of this brother ceremony thing, but you could still name after them. So when they say the name of the brother, do they literally mean the name, or they probably mean more like the family name? Because in classic society, and this is a lot of sources they didn't bring, a woman, this actually will help, I think this make a little bit more sense. A woman represented her husband. When you looked at a woman, ultimately she was, I don't want to say she was nothing, because that's degrading in multiple ways, but unfortunately there's some truth to that. A woman was essentially her husband. So when a Kohen sleeps with a woman who has been with other men, it's as if he's sleeping with those other men. They're not saying that explicitly, but that's kind of what's implied here. And that kind of makes sense. And they, there are people who in a very negative, hurtful way say, when a woman sleeps around, whoever she marries, it's as if, that man is sleeping with every man she's ever been with. And that's why one should be, never sleep with anyone. And we're putting aside the conversation of celibacy in Judaism, which is certainly a principle. One should not have sex before marriage. I'm putting that aside for now. I'm talking about the psychological reality, the experiential reality. And the way that the Torah is seeing this is that this woman brings with her the baggage of whoever she has been with. And in some cases, it's not appropriate. But we did see one case where it is, and that actually leads down to this next little thing I put together, which is who is forbidden to a high priest. So for a high priest, the only one that is permitted is 100% a virgin who has never been with anyone else ever, not a widow, not a divorcee, nothing. And the only connection that she has ever been is her family. The only man that she represents is her own father. But then we go to the regular priest, and in level of either increasing or decreasing, depending on where you look with it, in almana, a widow is permitted to it's forbidden for the high priest, but it's permitted to a regular priest. And the reason is that the baggage she brings with her, the man she represents, is another priest. So she brings the kedusha of the priest. So one priest is absorbing the holiness, the sanctity of another priest. So therefore it's fine. Why not the high priest? I think Dr. Feinstein might mention it, but the idea there is that they just need to be at like the absolute highest level. There's zero baggage whatsoever. But again, for a regular priest and a regular kedusha, it's okay for them to be with a woman who represents another priest. And then a divorcee, on the other hand, does bring with her that connection to someone with a different level of kedusha. And again, I'm not translating this as holiness or good or bad. It's simply a spiritual status that a Kohen needs to maintain to do their job. And then a halala, here I translate as non-virgin, but again, the context seems to imply, again, not a prostitute at all, not a woman who is inappropriate or sleeping around, but a woman who's been with a couple of men. Not simply that she's lost her virginity, but she's been with a number of men. And again, she brings that with her. And then, of course, the worst one on the list is zonah, which is a professional prostitute, which again, I'm not making any judgments on that now, but she explicitly is going to bring with her all of the, first of all, in terms of stock and status and reputation, that would be very bad for a priest. But to the idea that a woman brings with her any men that she's been with before, a Kohen cannot be with her. And so Dr. Eva Feinstein is going to now kind of bring that all together. And I want to thank her. I mean, I never met her before I read her article. She helped turn me on to a number of these sources. So I'll read this last source. So understanding these laws in terms of sexual contamination, and again, I understand that I don't like it, but it is the appropriate word. And the reason is contamination has a negative connotation, but it's literally what's happening here. These women, according to this hypothesis, this idea, are bringing with them something that they absorbed, a spiritual thing they absorbed through sex. And now they're spreading that or potentially bringing it to the Kohen. Shows how closely they are tied to the central theme of both Leviticus 21 and Yechezkel 44, which again is the Haftorah this week, the holiness of priests. Although the laws reflect concerns about genealogy and mixing of priestly and non-priestly seed, they are not about protecting the priestly lineage in a strict sense, meaning that a priest can marry someone from any tribe as long as they fit these different things. Neither are they simply about status. Remember, we had suggested it's maybe it's about status and stigma and everything like that, and she's rejecting that in the sense of ensuring that the priests have higher quality goods, because again, divorce is not a bad thing in any other place. There's something else going on there. Divorce does not make a person bad, and the Torah is very clear on that. It's fine. It's a mitzvah to divorce when appropriate to do so. Rather, they reflect a concern with safeguarding the holy, kadosh, from pollution. And again, pollution has such a negative connotation. Now, in some ways, the Torah might be saying, yeah, it's bad. You don't want to have them polluted with a lower kedusha. But again, it doesn't mean that someone from the tribe of Binyamin is a bad person and is not holy to God, but their kedusha, their status, they are not dedicated to God. They are not able to make offerings and serve in the Beit HaMikdash the way that a priest can. They simply have, I don't want to say it's the difference between having a master's and a PhD, because anyone can earn that. We don't really have anything like that in society that's not negative. You have that in caste systems where it's very negative, but the Torah has that. There's a specific tribe, and only that tribe and that tribe only, there's something inherent about their genetics and their bloodline that they are chosen specifically to serve in the Beit HaMikdash. No one else can do that. And if they mix their essence with the essence of other tribes, then they can't do their job. So ensuring that the priests remain fit to serve God, the source of all holiness. And I think that's the key thing here. It's not about demeaning these women, about them being bad or anything like that. It's just about the priest remaining fit and able to do their job. And part of that is they have to have a certain level of kedusha, and the way that they do that is they have to maintain who they connect with, and they can only connect with women that have never had a connection to another man, or for a regular Kohen, they can be with a woman who's only been connected to another priest. So it's all about that level of kedusha in order to serve God. And if you're going to say, all right, that all makes sense why they can do that, why do they need that level of kedusha? That is, you have to ask God about that, because that's a fundamental principle of the Torah, is that God decided that only the Kohanim have the level of Kedusha to serve in the Beit HaMikdash. And the Torah actually does give us some hints that it's because their tribe was not part of serving the golden calf. And there's other midrashim that suggest they were never slaves in Egypt. A lot of different ideas about that. But at the end of the day, God said, only a Kohen who has a certain level of Kedusha, a certain status, can serve in my temple. And anything that will take away or muddle that connection will not allow him to do his job. And then bracket that, but the rest of my people are still holy and special to me. So it's important to be able to maintain those two things. And even again, some of these things might be troubling, the way that women are perceived, the way that sex is perceived, but within the world of the Torah, Olam HaTanakh, this is a very compelling hypothesis for why Kohanim cannot marry outside. And the thing is, other than the high priest, meaning that any Kohen today could definitely marry a widow, the other things about divorcee and virgins are still, really divorcee really comes up more, are still technically forbidden, and there are repercussions for it. And the idea is that we are hoping, we pray that that kedusha, that sanctity of the priest, is maintained so that tomorrow when the Beit HaMikdash is built, they can go right back to their jobs. So this is something that we've continued to keep relevant, because at the end of the day, it's all about serving God.